Hello everyone. Today's topic we are going to discuss about the user story definition, and different ways how we can slice, how we can split the user story format, template, and a sample reference user story, along with the hands-on activity which we are planning to do on the 30th July 2022 weekend. Let's quickly go through the agenda. These are the topics which we are going to cover as part of the 30th July session. We'll start with a user story definition, and then the three C's of user story, how we can define the invest in the user story, the SPIDR approach of splitting user stories. Thanks to Gaurav Joshi, he shared the SPIDR approach of how we can split the user stories. And then the other available ways of splitting the user stories and a sample reference user story along with the acceptance criteria and the non-functional requirements which can be used as a reference, and then we will go to the hands-on activity for the defining the user stories. Let's get started. When we say the user story, it should be a small, simple, implementable way from the end user perspective. And it should be small enough for any agile team, any scrum team to be able to implement in a couple of days. And when we say the user story, it should be vertically sliced, touching each and every layer of the implementation like a cake slice. And that is how the user story should be defined. When we say the user, the typical standard or the format recommended for defining the user story is, as a user, I want to do the activity so that the business benefit, the actual value will be generated out of the implementation. Example or the sample reference story is, as a newly registered customer, I want to receive an OTP on my registered email address so that I can complete the authentication of the profile and go ahead with the successful registration of the profile. So here the user is the newly registered customer and the activity is listed down and the business value, the benefit is listed down. A typical anti-pattern, what is observed is splitting the story into analysis story, development story, DB story, testing story, or bringing up the role of the team members into the way of implementation. As a developer, I want to complete the implementation. As a tester, I want to do the validation. As a DB analyst, as a UAT user, this is not the recommended approach of defining the user stories. We might be following the recommended format or the template, but we are missing on the business value. We are missing on the logic of the implementation of the user story. So this is the anti-pattern or how not to define the user story. Moving on to 3Cs, any user story typically should include these 3Cs: card, conversation, and the confirmation. Card is nothing but the definition of the user story. Then the conversation, the discussion between the product owner, business analyst, and the team regarding the clarification, regarding the queries, questions, doubts, or the in scope, out of scope, dependencies, anything and everything is a part of the conversation. Then confirmation, the acceptance criteria of the user story, when we can say the story is implemented. These are the 3Cs of the user story to be considered when we are defining any user story. Moving on to invest. When we say invest in the user story, I stands for independent. Any user story which we define should be independent on its own. It might be having upstream, downstream, or before, after dependencies, but not during the implementation of the user story. That is how the user story should be defined independently. Negotiable comes from the scope implementation perspective, when to implement, which release this story can go, or whether this story should be implemented or not, or is it reprioritized, is it of low priority? All those things would be coming under negotiable. Valuable, the way how we discussed about defining the business value benefit the customer and user gets once it is implemented, that is what the valuable should be. We need to define the user story in a valuable way. Estimable or estimatable, without the team able to estimate in whatever the approach or the technique the team prefers to follow to do the estimation, we might not be able to go ahead with the implementation. Of course, many companies are moving towards the no estimates as the latest trend, but still, if you're following the estimates, we need to remember, we need to make sure the user story should be in a way the team can able to estimate on their own and go ahead with the implementation. S stands for small or simple. The story, once the team picks up, should be able to complete within the given sprint. T stands for testable. Once we say the user story implementation is done, there should be a way to cross-check, a way to validate, a way to showcase the value, the benefit which this user story implementation is brought into the picture. We should be able to showcase, we should be able to validate, we should be able to cross-check the implementation is done. This is about the invest approach of implementing or defining the user stories. Moving on to SPIDR without E. S stands for spike, P stands for path, I stands for interfaces, D stands for data, and R stands for rule. What is it? Spikes, paths, interfaces, data, and rules? Let's take a look at it. And it is defined by the Mountain Goat software as part of better user stories. So you can take a look at that if in case you need any additional details. Spike. Do we need a spike or a POC or any exploration before the implementation? Right. So rather than directly jumping into the implementation and spilling over the story sprint on sprint, we can try to do a spike and we can try to get a analysis. We can try to get a approach on how we want to go ahead with the implementation. And what is the expected output of spike and how much time it is required and how we want to do the validation, how we want to do the implementation, what is the logical outcome of the spike. We can discuss, we can define as a spike, and then we can go ahead with the actual implementation. P stands for path. How many paths, how many ways, how many steps we can do the validation or we can complete the end-to-end flow. That is what the path stands for. Right. When we say the path, let's suppose if you have to go from ground floor to 10th floor, you can go by steps, you can go by the elevator, and you can go on different paths. Right. So that is what the path is about. Like you can, if you have to enter any value into a text box or text field, you can enter using a keyboard, you can enter using a mouse, you can enter using copy paste option, or you can even pre-fill the value from the earlier previously stored details. So all these can be considered as different paths. So we can slice down using the paths as well in one of the way. Okay. Then moving on to the interfaces. This is where we can even discuss, we can even think about the integrations. Right. So how the mobile app versus the desktop version versus the tab, the iPad version is different. The functionality might be same, the look and feel, the user interface might be different. The way the screen looks like, the navigation might be different, right? And from the different browser, different operating system perspective, and when we have to talk about the integration, right? The third-party apps, the in-house, external, internal systems, all these can be considered as interfaces, and we can slice the user stories by taking these interfaces also into consideration. Moving on to the data, what all the different data we can enter, how many types of data or which type of data, what's the validations, any specific thing regarding the data, we can also define or we can also split or slice the user stories considering this also into the consideration. Moving on to the rules, what are the business rules, the logic, the validations required from the end-to-end implementation of that specific user story? And if in case there are any negative scenarios, yes, we can even slice them into separate user stories as well. Right? And if there is any pre-filled data or the default data or anything as such coming up, we can consider those as well, and we can do the validations, we can do the slicing of the user stories considering that approach as well. The other ways of splitting the user stories, we already discussed some of these, right? Where the workflow steps, the business rule variations, or what is the major effort? Yes, we can slice that down. And the simple versus complex. For example, if you want to enter into a Google search using one single keyword versus the other name, the textbook name, and the publisher name, the year of publication, the country, the origin, all those things can be given as a one single search criteria. There is a complex validation. Right? So we can try to break that in that way as well. The variations in data, the types of data we enter and do the validation. The data entry method, as we discussed, like by entering using the keyboard or pre-filled data, copy paste, or the using the mouse or the touch screen, all the different types we can do that. And the deferred system qualities, the operations, or when we say the operations CRUD is what we typically consider: create, read, update, delete. If you have to do one single thing, all these four operations on one single screen, one single field, one single parameter, we can slice that into different user stories as well. The use case scenarios, and then breaking out a spike or the exploration first, and then do the implementation. A sample user story following all these things, all these techniques or the approaches is like, as a registered user, I want to place the order by clicking on the submit button so that the order gets placed and I would be navigated to the payment screen or the page. So here we listed down the dependencies or the assumptions or the prerequisites as well. No need to explicitly define it within the user story. These can be linked directly within the tools, either Jira, Rally, or the Azure DevOps, or any of the tools, whatever the tools we are using for our implementation, we can use that and we can directly create the dependency or the links relations as well. So assuming the user is already logged in and having an active session, and this is one of the user story, and then assume the user already added items to the shopping cart, and there is other user story. And if we can see that the stories might be already planned into the respective sprints, so we can consider that into the implementation and we can plan and we can prioritize the user story. The other user story which is listed as a dependency is assuming the user has at least one item added to the shopping cart. Whereas if we can see that this is planned for the sprint 3. So based upon this, we can consider which sprint or when we want to implement the user story, the current user story, when we want to click on the submit button. Going ahead into the acceptance criteria, by following the given, when, then format, we can define the use cases, we can define the scenarios, and these are all the possible combinations. We can still slice down into smaller user stories, and we can still slice into simple, smaller modules or the implementations. Right. So if we quickly go through it, the first one is the positive happy path flow. The other things will be going ahead, and we can still slice down into smaller user stories, right? So the first example is given the user has items added to the shopping cart, when the user clicks on the submit button, the order should be placed and the user should be redirected to the payment page. So that is the basic validation or the basic navigation or the value which we want to implement as part of this user story. The next set of use cases, if we look at it, these are like the additional user stories or additional scenarios coming into context. It is up to us how we want to do the validations, how we want to slice it down and go ahead into the implementation, whether based upon the team, the product owner and the business analyst coming together and having the discussion whether we can implement as a one single user story or whether we want to slice down either using the SPIDR approach or the other approach which we discussed just now in the earlier slides. We can go ahead and slice down the stories into smaller, granular, simpler version of the user stories. Right. So here, if you see, the negative validations or the error validations are also covered within the current user story use cases or scenarios. The second scenario of displaying a error message when the payment gateway is down, or when the error occurred due to redirecting to the payment page. These are the error or the negative validations. It is up to us how we want to slice it down. So this is a high level user story. Now, by taking these approaches or these steps which we discussed just now, we can slice it into the smaller user stories as well. Moving on, we can, if we look at the last three use cases, those are regarding the notifications, right? Sending or receiving an email notification, the text notification, the WhatsApp notification. These are different ways, different approaches to get the updates or the confirmation of submitting the order. We can slice these three use cases into one single user story, or based upon the spike or the approach which we have to do, we can slice that into three simple user stories as well, because the way we generate and deliver email notification could be different. The content, the format, and the way we integrate and do the notification is different, whereas a text notification will be different and the WhatsApp notification will be different. If we consider all these logics, we can slice these three use cases also into three granular, smaller user stories. Now, coming on to the non-functional requirements, we need to consider inclusion of the non-functional requirements as well within the acceptance criteria, within the part of the user story definition that should guide us, that should help act as a implementation approach from the team perspective, from the product, from the user story functionality perspective. Here, if you see the non-functional requirements, the user should be redirected to the payment page and the confirmation should be generated within less than 2 seconds. Right. So this is like a performance non-functional requirement coming into context where the user is expected to be redirected into the next step of the navigation within less than 2 seconds. The next three non-functional requirements are in receiving the text notification, email or WhatsApp notification. All three, wherever possible or feasible or wherever within the scope, should be received or delivered within less than 10 seconds. So if we slice down these three use cases into three different user stories, we need to move these non-functional requirements as well into the subsequent user story. So that brings us to end of the discussion. Now, as part of the 30th July session, we will start doing the hands-on activity. Happy learning. Looking forward for the session on 30th. Thank you.